Welcome to the Daily Brain Podcast. Today's word is parsimonious. We will try not to be too stingy with the explanation and maybe simplify the complicated.
Oh, I like what you did there, applying the concept right off the bat. Yeah, it's a great way to illustrate how this seemingly simple word can be surprisingly multifaceted.
That's what we're all about on the deep dive, right? Extracting those golden nuggets of knowledge from a mountain of information. So tell me, how parsimonious are we going to be in this deep dive?
Well, we've got a stack of sources here. Everything from dictionary definitions to philosophical treatises to examples of parsimony in action across various fields. But don't worry, we'll distill it all down to the essentials, highlighting what's most relevant and insightful for you.
Perfect. So let's start with the basics. What exactly does parsimonious mean? I have a vague sense of it, but I bet you've got a more nuanced definition up your sleeve.
You bet. One of our sources, the Cambridge Dictionary, defines parsimonious as unwilling to spend money or use resources excessively. It also mentions that it can describe something, small or limited in size or amount. But it's more than just being thrifty, isn't it?
Yeah, it almost has a slightly negative connotation, doesn't it? Like cheap or even stingy.
Exactly. And that's where things get interesting. Merriam-Webster, another one of our sources, adds that layer of almost being too frugal, bordering on stinginess. Think of it as the difference between someone who's budget conscious and someone who's downright miserly.
Okay, that distinction makes sense. So how do we know when parsimony is a virtue and when it crosses that line into vice territory?
That's where context and intent come into play. Our sources highlight how parsimony can manifest in different ways, both positive and negative.
Give me some examples. I always find it helpful to have those concrete illustrations.
Sure. Imagine someone who meticulously calculates their share of a group dinner bill down to the penny, even if it creates an awkward or uncomfortable situation for everyone else. That could be seen as excessive parsimony, bordering on stinginess.
Okay, I know a few people like that. Definitely not the most fun dinner companions.
Right. On the other hand, think of someone who diligently tracks their expenses, saves for long-term goals, and avoids unnecessary purchases. They're being parsimonious with their money, but in a way that's responsible and strategic.
So it's all about finding that balance between being frugal and being resourceful. Right.
Exactly. One of our sources even emphasizes that mere parsimony is not economy. It's not just about hoarding resources, but about using them wisely and effectively. There's a quote from Edmund Burke that I think captures this perfectly. Economy is a distributive virtue and consists not in saving, but in selection.
That's a great quote. It suggests that true parsimony isn't about deprivation, but about making thoughtful choices.
Exactly. It's about understanding the value of things, allocating resources appropriately, and sometimes even being willing to spend money to achieve a greater good.
This makes me think of those stories about extremely wealthy people who live incredibly frugally. They could afford to indulge in anything, but they choose to live simply and prioritize other things.
That's a great example. It shows how parsimony can be a reflection of one's values and priorities. It's not just about money. It's about a mindset of intentionality and mindful resource allocation.
This is fascinating. We've already covered so much ground, and we haven't even delved into how parsimony plays out in different fields like science, art, or even everyday decision-making. Where do we go from here?
Well, one area where parsimony plays a crucial role is in science, particularly through a principle known as Occam's razor. Have you ever heard of it?
Vaguely. Something about the simplest explanation being the best.
You're on the right track. Essentially, Occam's razor states that when faced with multiple explanations for a phenomenon, the simplest one that fits the evidence is usually the preferred choice. It's about choosing the explanation with the fewest assumptions.
So it's like scientists are being parsimonious with their theories, opting for the most streamlined and elegant explanation.
Exactly. And this principle has been incredibly influential throughout the history of science, guiding researchers to develop theories that are both powerful and easy to understand.
Can you give me a concrete example of how Occam's razor is applied in science? I'm a visual learner. I need those images to really grasp a concept.
Sure. Let's take the example of phylogenetic trees in evolution. These are diagrams that show the evolutionary relationships between different species. When scientists are constructing these trees, they often apply Occam's razor, choosing the tree that requires the fewest evolutionary changes to explain the observed patterns of shared traits.
So they're looking for the most straightforward evolutionary pathway, the one that's most parsimonious in terms of the number of steps involved.
Precisely. It's like finding the most efficient route on a map. You wouldn't choose a route with unnecessary detours if a more direct path exists, right?
That makes perfect sense. But can you rely too much on simplicity? Could Occam's razor sometimes lead scientists down the wrong path?
That's a great question, and it highlights an important caveat about parsimony. While it's a valuable principle, it's not an infallible guide. There are times when the simplest explanation turns out to be incorrect, and a more complex solution is required.
Can you share an example of that?
Sure. Think about the geocentric model of the universe, which placed the Earth at the center of everything. For centuries, this seemed like the most parsimonious explanation, as it fit with everyday observations. However, as we now know, the Earth actually revolves around the sun, a concept that was initially met with resistance because it seemed more complex.
Okay, so it's a reminder that parsimony is a tool, a guide, but not a guarantee of truth. Sometimes the universe throws us a curveball.
Exactly, and this applies to more than just science. The concept of parsimony pops up in various fields, influencing how we communicate, create art, design products, and even make everyday decisions.
Wow, that's amazing. So parsimony isn't just about being thrifty with money. It's a broader principle that can guide our thinking and actions in a variety of contexts.
Absolutely, and that's what makes this concept so fascinating to explore.
I can't wait to dive deeper into these other applications of parsimony. This is already making me rethink how I approach problem solving and decision-making in my own life.
I'm glad to hear that. It's exciting to see how a seemingly simple word can spark such insightful reflections. You mentioned how parsimony can influence our everyday decisions.
Yeah, it's got me thinking about how often I get bogged down by having too many options.
That's a perfect example of where a parsimonious approach can be incredibly helpful. One of our sources suggests that when you're overwhelmed with choices, try focusing on the essential criteria that truly matter to you.
So instead of agonizing over every single feature or detail, I should try to simplify the decision by identifying my top priorities.
Exactly. It's about streamlining the process by eliminating unnecessary options and focusing on what truly aligns with your values and goals.
That sounds like a great strategy for reducing decision fatigue. But I can also see how this approach could backfire.
Yeah.
Especially if you oversimplify things too much.
You're right to be cautious. As we've discussed, there's a fine line between being parsimonious and being overly simplistic. If you're not careful, you might miss out on important nuances or alternative solutions.
It's like we talked about earlier with Occam's razor. Sometimes the simplest explanation isn't the right one.
Exactly. So while parsimony can be a helpful tool for navigating decision-making, it's crucial to maintain a balance between simplification and exploration. Don't be afraid to step back, consider different perspectives, and challenge your initial assumptions.
Okay, that makes sense. We've talked a lot about applying parsimony to our thinking and actions, but I'm also curious about how it shows up in creative fields, like writing and art.
That's a great segue. One of our sources highlights the concept of a parsimony of words in writing. It's about conveying meaning with clarity and conciseness, avoiding unnecessary embellishments or jargon.
So it's like the writing equivalent of Occam's razor, choosing the most direct and efficient way to express an idea.
Precisely. And this principle can be incredibly powerful in crafting compelling and impactful prose. Think of Ernest Hemingway, known for his spare, minimalist writing style.
Yeah, his work is a great example of how parsimony in writing can actually enhance the emotional impact.
You're right. It's about using words judiciously, allowing the reader to fill in the gaps and connect with the underlying message on a deeper level.
I'm also thinking about minimalist art, those abstract paintings with simple shapes and limited color palettes.
That's another fantastic example of parsimony in action. In art, it's often about achieving a desired effect or emotion with the fewest elements possible. It's about stripping away distractions and allowing the essence of the work to shine through.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between simplicity and impact, between saying enough and not saying too much.
Exactly. And this principle can be applied to various art forms, from sculpture to architecture to music.
It's amazing how this concept, which we initially connected to frugality, can be applied to so many different aspects of life.
That's what makes it so fascinating to explore. And we're not done yet. Our sources also highlight how parsimony shows up in some unexpected places, like evolutionary biology and even computer programming.
Really? Tell me more about that.
Well, in evolutionary biology, the principle of parsimony is often used to explain why different organisms might share particular traits. For example, if two species have a very similar physical characteristic, the most parsimonious explanation is that they inherited this trait from a common ancestor.
So it's like applying Occam's razor to the tree of life, choosing the evolutionary pathway that requires the fewest changes.
Or mutations.
You got it. It's about seeking the most straightforward and efficient explanation for the observed patterns of diversity. But I imagine there are times when this approach could lead evolutionary biologists astray, right? What if a trait actually evolved independently in multiple lineages?
That's a great point. And it highlights the importance of using parsimony cautiously. As with any scientific principle, it's crucial to consider all available evidence and be open to alternative hypotheses, even if they're more complex.
Okay, so another reminder that parsimony is a guide, not a rule book.
Precisely, and this brings us to the realm of computer programming. Believe it or not, parsimony played a significant role in how programmers write code.
You're kidding. Tell me more about that.
Well, programmers often strive to write code that is both functional and elegant, using the fewest lines of code possible to achieve the desired outcome. It's a bit like a minimalist approach to coding.
I'm trying to wrap my head around that.
Yeah.
How does parsimony in code actually benefit the program or the user?
There are several benefits. For one, concise code is easier to read, understand, and debug. It's also more efficient, requiring fewer resources to run. And it can even be more secure, as fewer lines of code reduce the potential for vulnerabilities.
So it's like those minimalist design principles we see in websites and apps. Clean interfaces, simple layouts, focus on essential features.
That's a great analogy. Parsimony can be a powerful tool for enhancing both aesthetics and functionality, whether it's in the digital world or the physical world.
I'm seeing parsimony everywhere now.
Yeah.
But as we wrap up this part of our exploration, I think it's important to remember that parsimony isn't a magic bullet. There are potential downsides to relying too heavily on simplicity, right?
You're absolutely right. And that's what we'll delve into in the final part of our deep dive, exploring the criticisms and caveats parsimony. Because as with any powerful tool, it's essential to understand its limitations and use it wisely.
Okay, so we've seen how parsimonious can apply to a surprisingly wide range of fields, from personal finance to science to art to computer programming. It's really fascinating to see how this concept of simplicity and efficiency can be such a powerful tool.
It is. But as with any tool, it's important to understand its limitations. That's why we need to take a look at some of the criticisms and caveats associated with parsimony.
So what are some of the potential downsides of relying too heavily on this principle? When does parsimony become problematic?
Well, one concern is that an overemphasis on simplicity can lead to oversimplification. We might overlook important detail or nuances by trying to force everything into a neat and tidy explanation.
It's like we talked about earlier with those minimalist organizational systems. They seem great in theory, but they often fail to account for the complexities and messiness of real life.
Exactly. And this can be especially problematic when dealing with complex social or political issues. There's a risk of reducing multifaceted problems to simplistic solutions, ignoring the systemic factors at play.
So instead of addressing the root causes of a problem, we might just be putting a Band-Aid on the symptoms.
That's a great way to put it. And this can lead to unintended consequences, or even exacerbate the issues we're trying to solve.
Another thing that comes to mind is the potential for bias. If we're always seeking the simplest explanation, we might be more likely to favor information that confirms our existing beliefs and dismiss evidence that challenges those beliefs.
That's a very important point. This confirmation bias, as it's called, can lead us down a rabbit hole of misinformation and reinforce our prejudices.
It seems like a paradox. Striving for simplicity can actually make our understanding of the world more complicated and distorted.
That's the danger of relying too heavily on any single principle or perspective. Parsimony is valuable, but it needs to be balanced with critical thinking, open-mindedness, and a willingness to embrace complexity.
So how do we strike that balance? How do we use parsimony effectively without falling into these traps?
I think it starts with recognizing that parsimony is a tool, not an ideology. It's one of many approaches we can use to make sense of the world.
So it's about being selective and thoughtful in how we apply it.
Exactly. We need to be aware of its limitations and be willing to consider alternative perspectives, even if they're messier or more challenging.
This makes me think of that famous quote attributed to Einstein. Things should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler.
That's a perfect summation. It's about finding that sweet spot between clarity and accuracy, between simplifying without oversimplifying.
So for our listeners out there who are intrigued by the concept of parsimony and want to incorporate it into their lives, what key takeaways should they remember?
First, remember that parsimony is about making intentional choices, not just about being cheap or minimalist. It's about prioritizing what truly matters and allocating your resources, time, energy, money accordingly.
Right. So it's about being mindful and deliberate, not just blindly cutting back on everything.
Second, don't be afraid to question simplicity. If something seems too good to be true, or an explanation feels overly simplistic, dig deeper, challenge your assumptions, and seek out diverse perspectives.
And finally, remember that parsimony is a journey, not a destination. It's an ongoing process of refining our understanding, streamlining our actions, and seeking elegance in our thinking.
Well said. And remember, even in our pursuit of parsimony, it's okay to embrace a little bit of messiness and complexity along the way.
That's a great point. Life is rarely perfectly neat and tidy, and sometimes the most meaningful experiences come from embracing those imperfections.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of parsimonious, I encourage you to continue exploring this concept and see how it can enhance your own life.
Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and are feeling inspired to embrace a more parsimonious approach to the world around you.
And remember, until next time, keep those minds curious and those perspectives open.